My name is Pam Hopkins. My maiden name was Biggam. My father was Alan Biggam, who came to Imbil in, I don't know, about the 1930s sometime, when he met my mother, who was Doris Gilroy, whose father was Roy Gilroy. And Roy Gilroy was born in Imbil in 1901, one of 11 children. And he met my grandmother, who was 22 years older than him. And she had come to Imbil with a family. I don't know, from Gosford anyway, and they met. And she originally had a store in Brooloo, and then I've only found a lot of this out through Ancestry.com, because my mother didn't know a real lot, and she built a shop in Imbil, which she died in 1950, and the shop was sold, and it eventually burnt down in the early 1960s, so it's gone. Well, my grandfather was a timberman. I've got photos of him with these huge logs and that sort of thing. There was everything in Imbil. There was a saddler, butcher shop. There were 2 grocery stores. This is up till 1957, at least when we left. 2 grocery stores, bank, pub, barber, everything you'd want. Doctors used to come out from Gympie once a week, and the dentist. Yeah, back then, the rail motor used to come out, and it would come from Gympie. No, it'd spend the night in Brooloo, go to Gympie and with school kids, high school kids, and come back in the afternoon, spend the night in Brooloo again. And you know, if you wanted to go to Gympie, you didn't have to drive. Because I went to Imbil Primary School, in grade 7 and 8, it was domestic science, but it was called rural school then. We used to come one day a week on the rail motor and just go to Gympie High School and learn to cook, sort of. Girls didn't talk to the boys anyway, so it didn't really matter at that age. Because my grandmother owned the shop, she also owned quite a few blocks of land along. The shop was on Yabba Creek, and she owned quite a few blocks of land along there. She built the post office, and she built the house beside the post office. And she also owned land that was down where the library is now. And I don't know, I think when I was about 5, she sold the house, which was beside the post office, to my mother. And that's where we lived from when I was 5 till when I was 12. And just went to school, and school was fun. And I was absolutely devastated when they sold out, because I did not want to leave Imbil at all. The store, then there was another shop, then the post office, and then our house. Well, I've got a lot of stories that my mother told me about the town when she was younger. She worked in the shop, and the shop used to stay open till 9 o'clock at night. I don't know what time it opened in the morning, but it stayed open till 9. And they used to have the dances on Saturday night, so she'd work in the shop till the shop closed, and then she'd go to the dance. And that was the big thing, the Saturday. And I can remember going to dances, but I was just a little kid anyway. But yeah, and even, you know, they discovered gold in Imbil way back. But Mum told me that there was still, while her mother was alive, and she died in 1950, while my grandmother was still alive, there would still be people coming in asking for credit because they knew where the gold was. I don't know whether she believed them or not, but she probably gave them credit. Mind you, there's a fellow we knew only a couple of years ago that camped up in the forestry for 8 months and panned for gold and made about $5,000. This fellow told us that while he was there were people coming out with metal detectors and they could never find anything, but he just did it the old-fashioned way, it was just... But talking about gold, have you heard of the Brooloo cemetery? No, it was a cemetery. It's on private property now, but I found it. Yeah. And there were about 3 or 4 people buried there, that's all. And some relative has been there in recent times and put up a proper headstone to somebody. But a fellow rang me up and he grew up in Imbil and he was talking about the Brooloo cemetery and he said that he and some other kids when they were at school, they went out there and there'd been a bushfire through the whole area and they found the old Chinese cemetery. He said he wouldn't have a clue where it was now, but because there'd been... And he said it was obviously the Chinese cemetery because it was all Chinese writing on the... So, well, there are 2 or 3 families of descended from Chinese still live in Imbil. It was terrible. It was terrible. Both my parents wanted to leave. I think Mum was about 34. She'd lived in Imbil all her life. She wanted to go and live at the beach, and that's exactly what we did for a little while. It was awful, and my sister and I, we used to come back and stay with friends for quite a few years after. But yeah, it was I was 12, my sister was 10, and it was a very, very important time of our lives, and we moved away, and it did make a lot of difference to our lives. We lived in Caloundra and sold one of our houses in Caloundra when our son was just about to start high school, and my stipulation was that he would have to go to the same high school as all his mates because I remembered what it did for me. I mean, Caloundra's a lot... Just moving from one house in Caloundra to another house in Caloundra is totally different. But my husband, because Caloundra was getting so big, he wanted to buy some property or just get away, and I didn't really want to. And we went for a drive in the country one day and we drove to Imbil because we used to occasionally drive to Imbil and just see, and it hadn't changed much. We drove to Imbil and we saw this house for sale on the creek. And we both said, gee, not very often a house on Yabba Creek comes up for sale. Anyway, we had a look at it. And we thought, oh, this is another story. You don't need to put this in if you don't want to. But the lady next door, when we were sort of walking around the yard, she came out and we were chatting and I told her who I was. And she remembered my sister and she remembered the whole family. And she said, you won't get to meet my husband because he's upstairs in bed. He's got cancer, he's dying. And that was it. Anyway, we walked around the yard a bit and I get goosebumps when I tell this story. We walked around the yard a bit and then she came racing down and she said, oh, look, can you help me, please? My husband's just fallen out of bed and I can't, because she's like a little tiny old lady who's now 102, I might say, and going all right. And she said, can you help me get him back in bed? So we went up. And he remembered my mother really well because he used to dance with her at the dances. They won a waltzing competition or something once. And he looked at me and he thought I was my mother, which was, it was a little bit, yes. Anyway, we got him back into bed and that was fine. Away we went. We were driving home and Josh, my husband, and we both said at the same time, we think that's almost an omen that we should buy the house. Anyway, we went home, we put in what we thought was an absolutely ridiculous offer. And then the estate agent rang up and said, oh, they've accepted your offer. And we thought, oh no, what have we done? And originally it was going to be just a holiday house, but we were just going there so many times. It was just, that was my Imbil fix. I had to get back there and sort of get it out of my blood. We've been there for 16 years now, and when we first moved back there was still a lot of people that I remembered. And in the 16 years, they've all just died one by one, and now there's hardly, except the old lady next door. She's one of the very, very few that's left. There's a few more houses there. The old picture theatre's still there. I mean, it's not operational anymore, but we used to go to the pictures every Saturday night. And the bakery, is now a cafe, and the butcher's still exactly the same. The library wasn't there. Post office is still much the same. And Mum used to go deliver groceries on horseback, and she used to ride right up past where the dam is now. And there was a family lived up where the dam is. I'd say it was swamped when the dam was built, and she told me that the kids had never been to school. That's all I know about that. I've never seen it, but when the dam gets really low, you can see all the old cattle yards that were there originally. Yeah, that was after my time. Yes, so it made my mother cry. I don't think it would have affected us where we are, but I don't know how. I don't think they'd planned on how anybody could get out or into Imbil. So it might have. It was awful. All the old photos of Yabba Road, it was a great big wide dirt road, and at some stage they decided they'd put the park in the middle of it. And I've just got a little personal story about when they were building the park. I was 5 years old, and I was allowed, my father was doing something, moving a shed or something down the road, and I was allowed to walk down to see him. And as I was walking down, the workmen, there were 3 or 4 horses, and they chased the horses, and the horses just galloped and knocked me over. And I've still got scars. All I remember is that I had a Vegemite sandwich and I couldn't find it again. I reckon they must have eaten it. Well, she had a little box brownie, and she just took, it's a whole lot of photos that after she died, my sister got all the photo albums, and I got a whole lot of photos anyway, but there's a lot more. And I keep saying to her, please remember, because she's in Brisbane, please remember to bring them, and I will get them eventually. But I sort of kept the ones that were more relevant to Imbil history, but I'm sure there's a lot more. Yeah, well, the photos are such good quality that you can actually, like a photo of Yabba Road, I can go in, blow it up, and just pick out a house that comes up really good. There's one of the shop. There's 2 of my mother and her father with horses standing in the middle of Yabba Road. And there's one of my grandfather standing up on the back of a truck with a log like that round. Awesome. But there's others at the pub and log trucks and all that sort of thing. My mother's older sister married Edgar Gomersall, and the Gomersalls were the ones that built the butcher shop and put the power in Imbil. And there's a plaque out the back across the road from the butcher shop where their power plant was. So that's, I've got the information, the dates and everything at home, but it's about 1939 or something. And they originally built, that was just put the generator in to power their butcher shop, and there was enough power left over to power the town. And the lady next door, her name's Wyn Stebbins, they came down, her husband came down on horseback from Gymna, sort of it wasn't a husband, it was a husband's father, the family. They came down from Gympie because they'd heard that the butcher shop in Imbil had power, so they'd be able to have a farm and sell their cattle to the butcher shop. Another thing that happened when I was really little, I can remember, well, two things. I can remember standing out beside the shop because the house was behind the shop, and I could see this smoke coming up and the kitchen was on fire, and luckily they put it out. I often wonder if, and the kitchen caught fire because of a build-up of soot and stuff in the chimney, and I've often wondered whether that was why the shop actually burnt down eventually. I don't know why it happened. And then another time when they were bitumening the road, I can remember looking out the back veranda down towards the traffic bridge, and I could see all this smoke coming up again, and the tar or something had caught fire. So, I wonder whether I'm attracted to smoke. Imbil has changed. It's not as good as it used to be because there's so many new people. But it's laid back. It was one of the worst things that happened in Imbil in the last few years was they put white lines for car parking. And, that was the whole irreverence of it I used to love, but it is changing. When they first put car parks outside the shop, all the locals used to make a point of not parking in them. But now you get into trouble, so it's the irreverence. Plus they didn't make the parks big enough because there's so many four-wheel drives, it was pretty silly. But when we were first there, because our house is right beside the bowls club, we used to go there fairly often. And my husband went there one afternoon for a drink, and because we had a canoe, he'd been paddling on the creek in his canoe and he saw a platypus, and he walked into the bar and he said, "Guess what? I saw a platypus." And they all said, "Oh, plenty of them down there." It was just, another story I remember. This was in the Gympie Times because I remembered it, and then I wondered whether I was imagining it. All the blokes were at the pub this night, and there was this big red glow in the sky up in the forestry. They all hopped in their cars and drove up to put out the fire. There wasn't a fire, but it was the aurora borealis. It was the most northern it had ever been. And I actually found the story. It really did happen. Well, that would have been, I don't know, sometime in the 1950s. There's a book, you'd know about it, 100 Years of the Gympie Times.
Yes.
And there's the story in there. My father had a taxi. It was with all the new Australians up at Stirling's Crossing. They didn't have any cars. So he came up with this idea, well, I'll buy a car and I'll be a taxi driver. And it was a really good business. But at one stage there were 7 taxis in Imbil, believe that or not. He was the first, yeah. And I think he was the only taxi driver who actually had a taxi driver's licence. And the rest of them just,
They were shonky.
Yeah, that's Imbil. That is what I like about it.
Country, yeah.
Well, my mother even got a taxi licence too, so she could drive the drinkers home from the pub when Dad had had too many. The 1955 flood, I think, was still the biggest flood ever, and we were living right beside the creek, and Mum and Dad took us up the top of the hill because they were worried the water might come up and flood into the town, which it never did, though some people think it did. It didn't. But, yeah, we haven't really got any photos of... Yes, well, there used to be a mark on the pylons of the railway bridge of how high it came. I think that's worn out. Where our house was, we were on the creek, but it was a steep bank, so you couldn't really see the water. But where I was sleeping, I can remember it rained all night. Sitting up in bed the next morning looking out, and here was the water. Well, there's a story, the garage down the bottom end of town that always goes under in any sort of a flood, and the mechanic's wife was at the pub, and she rang up the pub and said, "You better come home, the water's up to my ankles." And he said, "All right, I'll just finish my beer." And she said, "You better drink it quickly because it's up to my waist now." I mean, there's a fair bit of exaggeration there, I suppose, but our chook house was right down on the edge of the creek, and I think they must have got the chooks out. And then because we're next to the post office, Mum was friends with the postmistress, and they both decided that they'd just go down and see how high the water had come up. And they walked out and sort of stepped into it. I mean, we've had a couple of 2011, 2013. They were pretty big, but not as big as that. We were cut off for, 2 weeks or something. But after 2 weeks, you could get out of Imbil. But that's when the powers that be decided they'd better check up and see how people in Imbil were. So they sent a helicopter. But we'd been coming and going for days. They brought an army duck, because the bridge was washed away. I think that was the first time the bridge was washed away. There's been a few since then. The original bridge didn't have sides on it, and now with all the laws, they've got to put sides up. So when the big logs come down the river, the bridge was washed away in 1992 or 98 or something like. I don't really remember what it looked like, but and then the approaches to it were washed away in the next two big floods. Well, there's so much weed growing on the creek now. It's just needs not a big flood, but a flood. I could tell you a little bit about my grandfather. He was the eldest of 11 children. His father was Robert Gilroy, and his mother was Bella Bligh. And Bella Bligh's father was Peter Hutchinson Bligh, who lived at Kandanga, Bunya Creek, Kandanga. He came out from Scotland, and they were gypsies apparently. And they had this house on Whelan Road. It was a property on Whelan Road, and the actual house is still there. And apparently their firstborn was stillborn and was buried under a fig tree in the front yard. So I've driven past. No, the tree's not there anymore. My grandfather, he was a bullocky, basically, and got cedar and stuff like that. Was a real character. Married my grandmother when she was 40. My mother was born when her mother was 42, I think. And then he hung around till Mum was about 18 or 19, and he took off again. And he's an absolute character. And Mum's always used to say, it's such a shame that the Gilroy name it's been forgotten in the town. And I've sort of wondered whether maybe we could, plant a tree or something, or, just to keep the name there. But there are a lot of Gilroys in Kenilworth and Doyles. They're all related. Kandanga Township was set up for the railway line. Yeah. And every time I drive past that Bunya Creek sign, I wonder to myself, I wonder where my great-grandfather's property was. There's probably, you drive around that area, you do see old buildings and just wonder. And a lot of people don't care. They wouldn't have a clue. The old stove and stove recess are still in the Imbil pub. They're sort of boarded off, but, that was where the kitchen was. And that's, well, I looked up my grandmother's electoral rolls, and she and her first husband were on the electoral roll in Gunelda, and their property was called Boggy Flat Farm. I would love to know where that was. Yeah, I looked up all these gypsy origins of my great-grandmother in Scotland. Absolutely fascinating. Somebody got in touch with my mother years ago and said that he'd been looking into it, and he said that there were a lot of links, and there was a story that there was a link to a US president.
Oh, wow.
Anyway, I looked that up, and the name is Bly or Blythe, and Bill Clinton's was adopted, and his birth name was Blythe.
What?
I mean, from what I've looked, they weren't really nice people, but yeah. Well, Mum knew a bit about that side of her family, and when I was looking into it, I was telling her stuff, and she said, "Oh yeah," she said, the name Gypsy was mentioned, and she said, "Oh, nobody wanted to talk about it. It was just all very..." Well, see, Mum knew nothing about her mother's family. She just thought that her mother was an only child. And somebody, an old lady in Imbil, said something to her that her mother was a twin. And when I was pregnant, Mum said to me, twins run in families. Anyway, mind you, my niece has had twins since, but that's beside the point. But anyway, when I looked up my grandmother's family, this has got nothing to do with the gypsies, it's the other side of the family. When I looked up, she was one of about 11 children, and there were twins in the family, and the oldest twin lived till about 1994, and my mother didn't know she even existed. So she had an aunt, she had lots of uncles and aunts, and she thought that her mother's parents were dead, and they died after she died. So they're just deep, dark family secrets.